Hello, good evening. Welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm Holly Smith. I coordinate the business and policy programs here at the center. And I have the great privilege tonight of welcoming back Professor Christine Loh, one of our Asia Society Hong Kong Scholars-in-Residence, to continue her discussion of China's decarbonization efforts. Many of you know Professor Loh quite well, and as you know, she has held many titles over her long and distinguished career so far. And now she is the Chief Development Strategist at the Institute for the Environment of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, as well as visiting scholar at the Anderson School of Management Center for Global Management at UCLA. And Professor Loh is joined tonight by Evan Lee, the head of Energy Transition Research for Asia Pacific and Conglomerates Research in Greater China for HSBC. And I just want to point out that if you missed part one of Professor Loh's series, fascinating discussion on July 5th, it is available to view on YouTube at any time. And with that, I welcome to the stage Professor Christine Loh to start her presentation.
Evan, can I trouble you for the clicker? Well, thank you to Asia Society for hosting me, and thank you all for coming. I just want to start by explaining why I want to talk about this subject. I started life in natural resources, actually in Beijing. And my first time in Beijing was on the 2nd of January, 1980. I was very young, and I arrived in Beijing very late at night, so I can't see anything. The next morning, very early in the morning on the 3rd of January, I opened the curtains in my hotel room, and I looked out, and it was the clearest blue sky I have ever seen. And over the years of just being in Hong Kong, working with China in natural resources, traveled in China, we could see industrialization and urbanization. And by the mid-1990s, the blue sky that I saw and was so riveted by had become a disaster. So for me, I have been interested in following China's development, modern development history, and I have a particular interest in the environment because it is tied to industrialization and urbanization. I wanted to have, for myself, understand what China is doing in terms of development and environment. So the part one of the presentation that Holly talked about was a sort of brief potted history of China's environment from the 1980s. This is sort of part two, because we've come to a time now where we're talking about climate change, we're talking about China changing many policies to decarbonize. What you read in the media, a lot of it is about, well, but China is building many coal plants, building more coal plants faster than ever. So what does it really mean? Now, for me, I tried to make sense of this over a long period of time because I've been tracking what's been happening since the 1980s. So I tried to develop some perspective. I read as much as I can. I've had the privilege, going back to the 1980s, of meeting people in government in China, worked with many scholars and researchers in China. And when I was in the government in Hong Kong, I also had the privilege to work with policymakers on the environment and climate change. So I try to kind of put everything together. I try to understand what is happening, and that is what I would like to share with you today. I just want to say my basic message is everything is going to change. We cannot, in China, achieve carbon neutrality without many, many things changing. In fact, everything has to change. And I think you know the data that today over 80% of the world's energy is still coming from fossil fuels. So actually the revolution has to be large and fast. China is very important because it is the biggest carbon emitter. It is the biggest manufacturing economy. It has 1.4 billion people. So the task for China to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 is actually huge. So what I'd like to share with you is what I'm trying to go through, literally on a day-by-day basis, to try and figure out what is happening, how to stick the pieces together and see a bigger picture. Because for the next 10, 20 years, I probably will continue to follow this story. So what I'm going to share with you today is kind of like a halfway house for me. I won't live forever, so the story, in fact, will carry on. So that's what I like to share with you today. 5 things. We'll start with some background. We'll talk about China's transition. Then I want to share with you why I think China's plan to decarbonize is so radical. Radically positive, in my view. But there are, of course, huge number of challenges. And then I'd like to close with some concluding remarks. Don't worry about, I know it's a very busy picture here, but what I'd like you to focus on is, the 1980s, and I think half of you in the room was already around in 1980. So you will remember what happened then, and then you will remember that around 2006 and 2007, China became the largest carbon emitter, and GDP and all that, we're carrying on. And let us just remind ourselves certain important points about China. It is a large and still growing economy. It is the world's factory for so many things. It obviously has huge energy needs and still growing. China is still building out its energy system. And it needs all kinds of resources to be the manufacturer of the world. And it's manufacturing more and more sophisticated things. Now, there is something about balancing, and you can think about this in terms of any jurisdiction, any government. Let's just look at what energy security means. Because without energy, we won't be here today. I won't be able to talk to you. I won't be able to show you this. You and I won't be able to go home, and we won't be able to cook our meals. So all I'm saying is, energy is so fundamental to everything that we do, socially and economically. So energy security means availability at all times, in various forms, in sufficient quantities, and at affordable prices. So if you take that on board and think that if you're in government, what is it that you have to do to ensure that your people have enough energy? And in developing economies, they actually have to build out for all the things that they want to do, that they can't do right now because they don't have enough energy. So the world has to have a lot of energy for many economies to continue to develop. So being self-sufficient, this is one of the things I think is very unique about the Chinese. They always think, because I have a large country with a lot of people, I have to make sure that I can do a lot of things myself. I can't rely on someone else to do things for me. So therefore, one of the principles in the minds of Chinese policymakers is being as self-sufficient as possible. So you have to secure energy supplies. You have to have diversified sources and routes. If you're importing, where are you buying things from? You have to maintain social stability, because if you don't have enough energy, people are not going to be happy. You have to now balance growth and sustainability. These are some of the new principles that have come to become important in the past 10 plus years. Now, of course, you have to achieve carbon neutrality by a certain time. And there are all kinds of risks and crises that will happen. We can't predict what's going to happen in the future. Just look at what's happened in Ukraine. It's kind of stirred up for the whole world, energy supply and demand. So if you are in government and you're thinking about security of supplies of energy, and you have to balance all of these things, these are the things you have to consider. Now, again, this is a rather busy slide, but the reason I want to put it up is, what has China been doing? And you know China plans 5-year plans, so 5 year to 5 years, and very often they're really thinking 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and longer. They have centralized planning institutions, which you know about. So if we were to look at the earlier efforts from 2006 to the year 2000, you will see that China has a number of energy white papers. They're worth reading, particularly for those of you who are interested in research, interested in policy. It's important to understand what they say. And the thing about Chinese policy papers is they actually tell you what they're going to do, when, how, and how much it's going to cost, and so on. So it's important to read this. So actually, these kinds of things China has been trying to struggle with since the 11th five-year plan. Now, of course, we are at the 14th five-year plan today. Now, this picture I showed, I think, in my first talk, but I want to show again, just so that people understand. If we were to lay out what the Chinese government have said so far, this is the kind of pacing they are planning to go on. So this was very important for China, was to achieve a level of poverty alleviation. Requires a lot of energy, by the way, to lift people out of poverty. So this has been completed. We're at 14 five-year plan. So 14, 15, 16 is to achieve this. Energy efficiency, peak carbon is all going to come at this time. And then a little bit further out, they have more plans coming, but these are the ones that we're most concerned about right now, because these are nearer term and we can actually track them. And then by the 20th five-year plan, China intends to achieve carbon neutrality. Now, when I talk about energy security and having enough energy for the people, what sort of things am I talking about? And this isn't really just China, but this is what the Chinese leaders are thinking. Whoops, sorry. So global heat wave, right? We just went through that. China, very hot in many places. So people need to turn air conditioners on. We don't want brownouts. So that's why coal plants are being expanded or retrofitted, something they hadn't been doing for some time. But in the past few years, particularly in the past year, expanding coal plants has become important because of these kinds of problems. So it's getting hot, we need air conditioning, we need the lights on, we need to keep industry going. And secondly, this kind of other problem, other types of climate risk, extreme flooding throughout China, you need energy. When you clean up, you need a lot of energy to keep going. That's why the Chinese are pumping energy up, because you can't have no energy. Now, coming to the second point, we want to talk about now the 30-60 commitment. This really changed everything. This really represents a revolution for China. Just so that we understand this, China is the largest carbon emitter. The world's carbon emissions will only peak when China peak. So China understands how important it is for China to peak before 2030, because otherwise the world's emissions will not peak. Very, very important point. This is the promise that China is making to the world. And in my first talk, we talked a little bit about the structure of how China makes policies. I won't repeat that, but I will say that as far as China is concerned, there is a kind of mechanism called leading groups. So whenever the Chinese government believes something is really, really important and they need to coordinate, they create leading groups. So they have created a climate change leading group. The work of the, and this is the Politburo, right? I mean, this is right at top. These are the Politburo members who also hold, at the same time, the top government positions. So their job is to coordinate getting to peak carbon before 2030. So you have the top leadership personally coordinating the achievement of these targets. Now, this is kind of the approximate 2060 picture for China. I just want to read out to you the International Energy Association, the IEA. It published a report in 2021. This is not particularly about China, but about the world at large. But I'd like to read it together with you. So what they recommend was that people should, right, countries should stop new fossil investments as soon as possible, phase out the least efficient coal plants, retrofit the remaining plants by 2040. And what does retrofit means? It means to make them more efficient, so that your old plants can have a longer life if you need to have them. And 90% of the electricity should come from clean energy by 2050. So this is the IEA kind of recommendation. China is sort of following that. Now, but what is confusing for people, and you read a lot of newspaper reports about this, is China is building more coal plants. It is also importing more coal, but at the same time, it has a commitment to reduce coal use in the 15th five-year plan, that is between 2026 and 2030. It is going to peak carbon before 2030. You know already that it is also building out renewable energy and nuclear power going at huge speed, faster and more than anyone in the world. And it is also retiring its oldest coal plants. So, there's a lot of confusing signals about what is really going to be the picture going forward. Now, this is a little summary, and don't worry about reading the words. I just want to say that in the 14th five-year plan, there are commitments dealing with the modern energy system. One of the things you have to remember about China is it is still developing out its energy system. There are many, many issues still to be improved. It is building out renewable energy as fast as possible. The Chinese leaders will say something like this. They're using the 14th and the 15th five-year plan to reconfigure the energy system to lead to a breakthrough period, the so-called revolution. And actually, if they complete what they set out to do in the 14th five-year plan, China will reduce about 25% of China's total carbon emissions before 2025. So this is the start of the revolution. Big level commitments to reduce. I do want to now talk about, well, how are they going to do it? Why is China's plan radical when compared to someone else? I will say one thing. If you're tracking the carbon energy and carbon emissions plans in different jurisdictions, well, first of all, you need to be able to say an economy has a plan. and not everybody has very clear plans. China actually has one of the clearest plans amongst countries. So these are the three things that I think make up what I would call a radical approach. China is not giving up on coal yet. China cannot give up on coal yet because this is what they have. This is also the picture for quite a number of other developing countries. What they have is coal. You can't ask them not to use it for development. So what do we do? How do we balance emissions coming from fossil fuels and the need to clean up, right? This is the equation that all economies have to deal with. So the Chinese plan is they're going to, right now, 57% of the energy comes from coal. It's actually come down quite a lot from over 70%, but it's still over 50%. It's going to switch from primary, that means dominant, to coal becoming a backup source. This is the revolution. It does not mean they won't use coal at all, but they want to use coal as a backup source. Cleaning up the coal process, there is something called carbon capture and sequestration, which we don't have time to talk about today, but I do want to put it out there that it is a technical solution that is being tried out. We already talked about this, right? Peak coal. Renewables will beat coal for electricity by 2045. That means by 2045, electricity, more than 50% of the electricity will come from renewable energy. In fact, a lot more than I think 50%. Coal plants are being phased down and then phased out from the 16th five-year plan. I'm just showing, what this carbon capture and sequestration looks like, but we probably don't have time to go into that. It's quite controversial. Now, I want to focus on how China is going to do it, the radical approach. What they're doing is looking at the vast country and looking at what resources they have. So if you look at these bits, these are China's desert areas. They're desert areas, it's like 4 of France. Right, so China has lots of desert areas up here. Here is wind. This is where they have a lot of wind. Here's where they have, so darker side is where they have a lot of sun. Now, obviously, this is the Himalayas. You're not going to do much up there. But this area here, right, this area here is where China is building ginormous energy bases. Very, very interesting how they're looking at this. And what I ask you to do is look at this as a giant plan. Now, throughout history, the Chinese have examples of massive plans. You remember the Grand Canal, the Great Wall. Chinese policymakers actually have very big ideas. Today, you're seeing it. Build out railways, right? Massive buildings. These are examples of another massive idea. Put wind and solar together up in the north where there's a lot of natural wind and solar. At the same time, here's near this area, it's also where you have a lot of coal. So you remember earlier on, I said that they're going to use coal eventually as backup. The thing about wind and solar is it's intermittent. So when the wind is not blowing, when the sun is not shining, what are you going to do? Or maybe there can be days where there is a lack of renewable energy for whatever reason. You're going to have to turn something on that is reliable. It's going to be coal. So that's why It's as a backup power. China will use those desert areas massively. Nuclear power. You can see that most of the nuclear power today are along the coast. So again, one of the things about nuclear power is once you've built it, it kind of keeps running. It's very reliable as a base load. China never gave up on nuclear power. In fact, because China realized right from the get-go that it has such a large need for energy that it cannot give up on any source of energy. And that's why today in China, they're developing everything. And going forward with new energy, hydrogen, ammonia, they're doing everything. And the thinking from the policymakers is China cannot afford not to invest in energy, any form of energy, because their demand, their need is so great. So if we were to carry on, I want you to have a sense of what building these bases look like in the middle of the desert, right, up in the north. This is one of the deserts up in the north. I mean, we're talking about massive, massive solar plants. Massive. You know, I've just put down 2 pictures here. You guys can go, you know, into the internet and look at all these amazing places all over China, on mountainsides, on, you know, in deserts, giant, giant bases. Now, this is from one of the people who do, I think, very interesting work on energy. So they are also showing. So here's your base. Then there are other bases spread around. If you are generating energy here, you've actually got to get it, right, to the other countries. Because up in Inner Mongolia, Shanxi, you know, Xinjiang, there isn't any heavy users there. But there's a lot of potential for energy. The energy has to be transported somewhere else. If you're by the coast, the blue are the offshore bases. So that's offshore wind. And you will remember the picture on the nuclear bases. I mean, all this is designed in a way that the reliable base load is there to keep it going, to support the renewable energy. So again, offshore wind. This is just happening right now. Deep sea floating winds. They're not just now, you know, with wind power. It's not just the stuff that we're used to seeing that is nearer to the shore. They're now building giant, you know, wind turbines on floats that are much further out into the sea, where the wind is much stronger. So again, you need the engineering to bring the energy back on shore. So these are the things. China has been building a lot of these transmission lines to take the energy where it's being generated to where it's being used. Batteries. That's another technology China is spending a lot of time on. So when the wind is not blowing, right, when the sun is not shining, but you can store the energy in giant batteries. So apart from running your coal plant, which you don't want to do unless you have to, and you can't build nuclear plants everywhere else, so one of the things you can do is develop battery technology to store the energy that is coming from renewable power. So China is a leader in this, and you can see China is outdoing everyone else. The other thing that is interesting is, and I know there's a lot in the news about the Belt and Road, there's a lot of news about BRICS and so on. One thing that is important is China already is doing cross-border transmission lines with the regional neighbors. Chinese power companies, they have a competitive edge, and they're investing in various things in the neighborhood. So not just in mainland China itself. So this is going to be an interesting picture, and this is why China is important. China's technology, its know-how, these bases, it's all going to have a different picture when we look outside China's border into the Belt and Road, into the neighborhood. All these things are kind of being planned, discussed, and being built. But, okay, so that looks like a really interesting picture, but there are a huge number of challenges. So I do want to end by sharing with you what these challenges are. Well, there's a heck of a lot to do in a very short time. It's hell to coordinate. And one of the problems, traditional problems throughout China is because it's a very big country, yes, it has a centralized government, very powerful, yes, but actually it's been hard always in Chinese history to command to every corner of the country. So balancing everything, you know, having to deal with all kinds of vested interest is not easy. And it's a current situation because you are going to read in the news that, you know, some province is going to want this, some other province is going to want that, some is going to slow down on this because it's to their interest. All those things are probably true. But what I'd like to share with you today is, let's try and hold in our heads, what's the big picture? And so the thing to follow is, from year to year, from 5-year plan to 5-year plan, is China still on track? Are they going to hit the big targets? Because if they do, they're going to get there. They're going to get there. There's going to be, they're building all these new coal plants. So actually you can say that by 2050, China will have the backup coal plant that is also the cleanest in the world. Because the coal plants they're building today are the new technology coal plants that if you have to use coal, it's the best technology to use. So it will have the cleanest coal plants. There'll be stranded assets, which I'm sure Evans can talk a little bit more about, right? I mean, you know, you're building all of this stuff, how you do your finances, who's really going to be paying for them, you know, is it worthwhile to do it like that? I can't answer those questions, but there are going to be these kinds of issues here. And massive talent. It's really important China keeps pumping out good managers for energy, engineers, and so on, because they're going to need a lot of these people to power this revolution. So my last slide is some concluding observations. Coal is reliable and affordable backup power, whilst China continues to build out at a massive and rapid pace all kinds of renewable energy. Nuclear takes time to add, but they're going to do it as fast and as much as possible because it is highly reliable once it is built. Coal consumption will peak in the next 5-year plan. This is a really, really important thing for all of us to watch. Global carbon peaks when China peaks, right? Before 2030, China's commitment to the world has to be fulfilled. China is retiring old plants, and by 2050, there'll still be coal, but it'll be the cleanest coal plants in the world. So let me stop here and invite Evans to help moderate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. And I deeply appreciate, you've gone through, taken like 30 minutes, just to give us a really good view of where we're standing in this region, right? Looking at this view from 30,000 feet above. And just a quick introduction about myself. My name's Evan Lee. I cover energy transition at HSBC at Global Research. And I've known Christine for a long time. And I spent a lot of time understanding energy, utilities, renewables, for the last 20 years or so. And I would like to sort of kickstart with one question. But before I do that, I want to sort of recap some of the things that you've sort of shared. I think the connection between flooding and environment and also energy is sort of interesting. I don't think a lot of investors in the capital market does think about it this way, but it does create a lot of energy needs. And I totally agree about your view about there's a lot of mixed signals, especially if we sort of zoom in a little bit over the last few months. We've seen, obviously, China has been making a lot of statements about commitments on climate. And Sinopec obviously has also announced the demand for gasoline has peaked, which is also very interesting because a lot of media did talk about it. But the fact is that that was a projection that was made about 2 years ago, so it wasn't very surprising to us. But we think that the noises have come out a lot. But at the same time, we've seen gas-fired power plants being shut down recently in the last 2 months because they've basically given up using gas, which is obviously very expensive and imported, and switching into coal plants. So recently, we've done a little work just to look at energy intensity or carbon emission as a function of GDP, because obviously China has made clear targets for 2025 and 2030. So one question from myself actually to you is that I think you do agree that the direction is quite clear, and I think I'm with you on that. So we know where we're getting, and we have good confidence that we will get to where we want to be over the long term. But would you say in the very near term, we're sort of scaling back a little bit? Or when we look at the pace of development, do you think the priority is more about hitting the 2030 target, but bearing the risk of the 20 to 25 target in terms of emission and intensity of GDP might or may not be reached? How do you think about that? Yeah.
China generally feels really bad about failing an exam, right? So if they fail on the commitment that they've made, they generally don't like that. However, we talked about, there is a lot of vested interest here and there. And let us not forget that the coal industry is a vested interest in China. And I think the people in the coal industry, if you track the Chinese media, what they say, some of the leaders are saying, hey, this is our opportunity to build coal. So what I find interesting, and I don't have the capacity to do that, is to actually work with Evan and others. Because if you're in the business of tracking the coal companies, the energy companies, you will kind of have a much clearer idea of kind of what they're doing that year. So I'm interested in trying to understand where is the vested interest trying to come in to do what. But since I'm not sort of in the business of selling anything, and my goal is to look at the big picture, I have to take a slightly longer term view, and I have to go and talk to people who are, again, looking at a sort of bigger picture. So I do find what we can do in Hong Kong, and I guess this is one of the pitches I want to make, is it's really important for Hong Kong to understand the big moves in China, because we are going to be serving Hong Kong in terms of what we can help to finance, what we can help to do, other services that are happening in China. And because China is relevant to the Belt and Road, China is relevant to the world, the technology that it has. If we wanted to be financing those things, right? If we wanted to play a role in the expansion of that, then actually what Hong Kong people have to do is to understand very well and be able to narrate, right, because you need to understand it, and see where you can make intervention. So that's why I think in Hong Kong, maybe some of the things that we can do better in the future is combine the academic world with, you know, the financial analyst, because maybe in your daily work, you kind of don't take the sort of view that we're taking, because you have to drill down on the companies and decide whether you're going to recommend people buy stock in them or not, which we don't do. But we can combine our views to see what actually is happening on the ground and then follow it from year to year.
Yeah, it does make sense, because we do see a lot of mobility data from, you know, on and off. Because we, you know, the key thing that, you know, that I do sort of worry is that when I look at emission intensity, because China always put, as you always described in the past, it's all about, you know, putting a target for intensity to GDP. But even looking into the last 2 years, because of COVID, because of energy demand, how that's have changed, I sort of feel that I'm not sure if we're on track with our 2025 target, if the pace is going to happen, you know, it's going to go on as it is over the last 2 or 3 years.
I think they're going to build up as much as they can now and then drop. Because only by doing that can they reach their target. And so since they still have to deliver on that target, they're taking this, what the coal industry is saying, this is our final golden opportunity. So let's watch this very carefully for the next couple of years, because after that, they will have to drop.
This makes a lot of sense. And it is very true that the strategies to look at how energy mix should change over time. And in fact, China's really changed that really quickly. And I think most of us still believe that China has been very good, you know, and competitive in manufacturing, you know, very cheap solar panels, wind turbines, and the cost of energy storage has also gone down a lot over the last few years. I think a lot of that's because of scale, you know, very competitive energy cost, and also they've adopted very new technologies in place to realize all that. But then you really think about, you know, from on the supply side, with I guess we can't really avoid talk about geopolitical risk, with what's really happening from the outside world. And these companies are sort of struggling at the moment, right? They're facing overcapacity. You know, there's way too many production lines in China, but they can't export because of restrictions and tariffs and sanctions and this and that. Do you think China will stay continuously competitive on this front, and especially when the government is not sort of, you know, paying subsidies on time to the utilities, which is obviously a big topic, you know, for years. How do we think about the supply chain, or do you think the government just keep on, you know, injecting capital and incentives to make sure technology are staying on the front line?
If we watch the Chinese government, they tinker a lot. You know, they're tinkering with all kinds of things that in other economies, the government does not have the ability to do, but the Chinese government does. So in a way, when we're always looking at some kind of disaster down the road, right, and it doesn't actually happen, or somehow the Chinese are able to manage it in a way because they have the privilege of kind of managing everything. So this is a sort of general statement that can apply to obviously more than just the energy area. And in terms of competitiveness, I really think Ukraine, what's happening there, has provided the kind of opportunity that no one has expected. Because what you've seen in the last year is China has been signing long-term contracts with countries in the Middle East, you know, with the Saudis, with Russia, and it has already secured good long-term prices for quite a while. So that means, unlike, for example, economies in Europe, I mean, look at Germany. One of the pain in Germany is it is not competitive because its energy cost is now much higher. So just in the flip of 1 year, it's made an extremely competent economy actually kind of have to change. You know, they're going to have to get out of this rut. But the Chinese have been able to secure cheap long-term energy. So what it produces is going to be cost competitive. And, you know, their supply chains and so on, that's still pretty robust. And who are they going to sell it to? If they cannot sell it to the G7 countries because of geopolitics, now just think, these ideas of the huge bases, we are now going to see them in the Middle East. And who is going to supply the solar panels? It's going to be the Chinese. Right? So what I'm saying is, this new picture of who is now friends with whom, if they all agree, which I think these are some of the deals that they are discussing, how will, for example, Saudi Arabia and China cooperate? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of energy and money going backwards and forwards, but also, what is the technology? What is the kind of know-how? How do you then get the two of them to work together? Climate change, decarbonization, will be a very, very major area. So if we keep watching for another couple of years, I think you're going to see China continuing to be able to export what maybe we call them new energy exports. They'll probably still do pretty well.
That's a good point, because countries outside of G7, it's a very strong market in growth in both solar and wind, as we see. We've seen a lot of growth opportunities in Southern America, Africa, and the Middle East. Those were the sort of the underdogs, that surprised us on growth over the last couple of years, and continuously that could be one big driver. You could be very right.
I think one of the things, and you see, the BRICS country talking to each other, one of the issues that they talk about is about energy and climate change. So if they're talking about collaboration amongst themselves, what sort of things, what role could China play? Obviously is these kinds of products, and how to stick it together. So these giant bases, how to stick it together, China's actually doing it. So you can see Saudi Arabia wanting to do it, right? So it'd be potentially very interesting collaborations.
Yeah, because I have so many questions. But I want to ask maybe one or two more before we go into Q&As. Because we did talk about the supply side. You did talk about technologies, the challenges on the energy side, and how that mix is being rebalanced. But how do we think about demand, right? Pricing, because I think when it comes to price-based policy, China tends to be quite nervous about this, right? And especially coming to power, gas, oil, prices. How do we think about that as a way to, because we could do a lot of things on supply, but do we have enough, in place, to control demand? Yeah,
that's a really good question. About demand is who uses the power. So the demand for, let's say, industry, the demand for, you and me, right, so ordinary citizens. First of all is no brownouts, right? So being able to maintain reliability. Secondly is, but they know how they price all of this. There's a function on the engineering side, because we haven't anywhere in the world, right? This is actually a really new experience. When your grid has to deal with coal and gas and, intermittent stuff coming from hydro, coming from wind, you're mixing all of this in. It's a real test of the management system, of the robustness of your engineers, how you manage that, and how you then price it. Now, today, it is possible for an industry or for a company, right? For a company in an industry, let's say you're manufacturing petrochemicals. It really has happened, where you go and you buy from the grid company only clean power. So you can actually say what you have produced, these chemicals that you're producing, has been produced from zero emissions energy. Now that becomes important, because if you're exporting and you're exporting to Europe, and in a few years' time they're going to want you to be able to say to them, what is your carbon content for the export? China's going to be competitive because they can do this. But before they can sort all of this out, they need to price, they need to sort out the robustness of their grid system. This is all kind of happening right now. And if you're going to add in batteries and hydrogen and whatnot, yeah? But the Chinese are good engineers. They'll sort it out in the end. So you're completely right. I think the demand side could be a bit messy. the pricing may not make too much sense, and some companies you may not want to invest in because they may not be able to do it well enough. But if you pull yourself back and look at the big picture, then that's kind of the way things are going.
Maybe just sort of a quick add-on to that, because you did show a chart, for all of us about the 70-year journey that we've gone through in China on climate and strategies. How do you think about at this current administration under President Xi, how things could be different, especially when it comes to repricing or adjustments?
During the first talk, I talked about President Xi. And if you read any of his writings, not that I think many of you will, but he has a long track record, and I'm talking about like 20 years plus. He has a long track record of focusing on the environment. Everywhere where he has been governor or party secretary, he has left behind real significant practices of the environment. So, in Fujian, in Zhejiang, right, these are places where he has played a role. These provinces have continued to be leading in certain areas. So President Xi has made it quite clear, as far as the environment is concerned, he thinks this is the way to improve the development, the economy, the economic development of China. He does not look at climate change or, for that matter, nature conservation. He does not look at these as environmental policies. He's made it quite clear that these are development principles. So I think he's going to push pretty hard. And he was the guy who stood up in the UN to say, hello, 30-60. So that is, for the Chinese, the highest level of commitment a leader can give.
Great. Because I don't want to steal too much of the time and leave some time for questions. Maybe we could open the floor for questions. We do see a raise of hand, maybe on the gentleman at the back. He's probably the first one.
KK Chen, on behalf of Footprints Foundation. Christine, as a good friend of yours and a big fan of yours as well, okay, allow me to thank you for clearing the confusion a lot of people have in the past many years. Okay, my question is, having said all this, and we know that COP28 is coming up, if you have one little vote, one little say in Dubai, what will you say? Thank you.
Please allow me to answer this question slightly differently, in the sense that I think COP28 is just become more interesting with the BRICS arrangement. I was asked this question about what expectations or how I see COP28 might be, right, in the first talk, and I said at the time that because we cannot do without fossil fuels, and it's going to be held in the Middle East, that I hope there'll be a kind of sensible discussions about how economies are going to be dealing with fossil fuels, and really some kind of collaboration and plan, and then the phase out. Because you will remember in the last two COPs, there was a lot of pressure on phasing out. And India and China did not like the phasing out. They said phasing down. So I think you can see why India and China will not agree to phasing out. They will talk about phasing down, because these are the kind of plans they need to have. But now that we have BRICS, and we know that we will have new BRICS members, how they will talk about some of these issues could be even more interesting at COP28. And I think from my point of view, I would be spending time trying to watch how those conversations will go, because I think it'll give us an idea of how the BRICS countries are going to collaborate on decarbonization.
Cannot agree more. Thank you.
I said there's a question, a gentleman in the front, pink shirt.
Thank you very much for excellent, thought-provoking presentation. Just a very quick question. What role do you see for carbon pricing in China in terms of driving that pace of decarbonization? And it would sort of seem generally, Europe has made great strides around its ETS, but China seems to have slowed down its adoption of pricing. Perhaps you could give us some views on that, Christine. Thank you.
I suspect the idea of pricing has just been too hard. And they have a very nascent system. We're not even sure when they're going to be expanding it. The price that comes out is relatively low. So I think the policymakers see that there's still a lot to be done. So one way of dealing with how they go forward is not necessarily to have a carbon price, because as I said, their system is kind of not figuring that out yet, but a substitute to that, and for them to remain competitive, and it suddenly bursts forth with Ukraine, that they can now secure very reasonably priced energy for the longer term, and they're going to be building out. I mean, what we see is, it has surprised me how fast they suddenly pump in lots of money in a slowing economy on renewable energy. So they're preferring to do it on the supply side to get to a world that has not yet completely bought into carbon pricing. Because if you look at many other economies, well, who's really mandating carbon pricing? You know, so I think the Chinese have kind of just probably put that aside for now.
Because the two things I might have to add, is that, we've seen a lot of activities going on over the last few months. Electricity prices have sort of been more relaxed since 2021, and much more. I think recently there's been more provinces opening up the retail market for electricity as a way to sort of set the platform for carbon pricing and the RECs, the renewable energy certificates, to come on for trading. So I think the momentum is definitely, is there. Just that, as to when, that will really happen. Yeah, gentleman on the back, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. This is Mo, and I'm from Egypt, and I'm part of the ASHK Global Fellows Program. COP27 was held in my country, in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, and at this time we knew that the Egyptian government has signed 83 billion of green FDI with their European counterparts in green hydrogen specifically. And even recently, the Financial Times has released a report that Egypt and Saudi Arabia are the largest FDI recipient of green hydrogen all over the globe, and they have ambitious plans to reposition themselves to be a green hydrogen hub in the Middle East and North Africa. So you touched upon the point that many Middle Eastern countries has a long-term deals with China, so China has secured a reasonable price in the long term. But from different angle, from Europe, Europe sees a very large potential of green hydrogen. That's why British Petroleum, Eni for exploration, has announced recently new investments for billions of dollars in those countries in the Middle East. So my question is, how do you perceive the potential of green hydrogen and how it could be integrated in the Chinese radical plan for decarbonization? Thank you.
Yeah, no, you are completely right. The Chinese are as interested in new energy, particularly hydrogen, than everybody else. They already have ongoing plans and plants and so on. So, it's already kind of out there. And as with any new kind of energy, and as I said earlier on, China's not giving up on anything. So they will continue to invest in hydrogen. And I wondered, perhaps, do you cover the companies doing hydrogen as well?
We do look at.
So what are they doing?
Yeah, so I have to say, China is making big investments. Sinopec obviously is leading the way. It's one of the, spearheading a lot of the big projects, investing in the mega-sized solar farms to create renewable energy so that they could use that energy to create green hydrogen. So because brown, purple, gray hydrogen is already available sort of in China, but I guess that's not really the point, right? Just how to turn into green. And the electrolyzers that being manufactured by some of the companies in China could cut costs by 50% as they develop onwards for the next few years. So that could, provide, a much lower unit cost when that green hydrogen comes into place in the next few years. So it's good. I think, we are heading to the right direction, as sort of described. And the pace is very, very quick. But the thing is, we're starting from a very low base. So, even by 2025 in our projection, that's probably not going to be very meaningful.
Everybody is starting at a pretty low base, right? But, the issue is we're going to watch it carefully to see how fast it can be ramped up and in different parts of the world, what we're going to be able to do.
Yeah, we have a question from the blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. Well, one observation on Ukraine. I hope you don't mean that the opportunism of a war created by Russia creates for China in terms of energy prices. I hope that this is not a strategy incorporated by China, just to set that straight. My question is more, it's not a challenge, but it's a real question. 2060 is very far away, yeah? And you observed most of us were here in 1980, which means that by 2060 we won't be here anymore. Now, in your presentation, you say that coal is needed, more like a reserve, as a backup plan. I didn't hear you say, Christine, that the coal was absolutely necessary for the further development of China, but maybe I didn't hear it. My question to you would be, theoretically, if China would now drop its coal ambition, and let's say we invest more in the beautiful examples, the technology on the renewables, there's plenty of technology, there's plenty of space, etc. If they were to take that decision, which should come from the highest level, would then 2050 be achievable technically by China?
Over the years, when I've tried to track China, I look at patterns because I don't know what the answer really is going to be. Because, of course, we can have scholars do the calculation and say, if you did this, you would do that, and we can do many variations. But in terms of, is it possible for China to get far enough to actually be able to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, and how early before 2060? 2050, 2055, that I would wait and see. Because I don't know, life going up and down, what issues there would be. And I think the issue about Ukraine is, of course, I'm not saying this is part of their strategy, but what I'm saying is things happen in the world that it kind of upsets everything. And when something like that happens, there are both risk and opportunities for different interest, let's put it that way. But the fact is, what has happened in Ukraine has changed the energy supply and demand market in the world by quite a lot. That's all I'm trying to say. And at this moment, not only for China, but also for India, they've been able to secure long-term contracts at good prices. And that's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, we have a question from the lady at the back.
Thank you so much for your sharing. I'm just, from the presentation, I understand there's a lot of radical change, like investments into renewable energies as infrastructure kind of projects. I understand like the coal plants, a lot of it is majorly state-owned companies that are running it right now. Because I'm not familiar with the field, I'm wondering if you have numbers on the proportion of this type of renewable energies. Is it still going to be government-owned type of investments, or it would be like driven by private equity investments or like joint ventures with sovereigns, etc.?
Yeah, maybe I could take that. So in terms of power supply, coal is about 65% as a mix, and then renewables between solar and wind, it's about 12%, growing to 20% by 2030, growing very quickly. But then you have hydropower, right, which is always about 10% of the mix. So out of all of that, I would say 90% of them are state-owned. Even with the renewables, in the early days, about 5-10 years ago, a lot of private companies have invested, including companies I think I've met here today. CLP has invested a lot in renewables in mainland China, including some others. But the truth is that over the last 5 years or so, most of the investments were made by the state-owned, mainly the major energy companies, because they do have the advantage not just on cost and construction, but mainly on financing as well locally. Yeah. I mean, that answer your question. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My name is Dr. Sanjay Nagarkar. I'm in the Blue Ocean Technology, Hong Kong, carbon technology. Thank you very much, Christine, to give a wonderful insight. And because I'm from India, living in Hong Kong more than 30 years, so we follow both India and China and the collective things. And what you mentioned about the BRICS and all the past COPs, this thing. So India and China are the only two countries which rightly said, they said like, slow down the process rather than the out, right? And the target is both like 2060. In your presentation, you mentioned like most of the clean energy work is the northern side of the China, and then you mentioned like a lot of like the ocean, the wind, like the offshore kind of thing. So this is one advantage, the land mass available to clean, develop the green and clean energy, and all the ocean like available, like this is the land mass is basically the ocean mass kind of thing. India, on the other hand, has a limitation in terms of the size of that big, putting like the mild some solar panels and the kind of thing. So there is a carbon calculation from everywhere, but both countries are very high populations, so obviously there's a too much demand, like there's a consumption. Is there any statistics available? So that's the question, like which separate like the domestic carbon footprint versus the carbon footprint which is like used for the export purposes. So like every country has like the export oriented units, like so that's the carbon footprint for the export purpose. And then there is a like domestic consumption with the local population, because what I feel like if this part is included separately, then it will help the policy making to deal in a much better way. You chop down, and the financial people understand very well, when you chop down certain thing, you can have like certain better solution of it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. On the basis of the industry, right, the industrial side, and calculating carbon, use of water, and things like that, with the ESG coming, and also China's policy in making sure that its exports are competitive. This is where a lot of calculations can be made. For China, they're also looking at consumption on a per capita basis, the ordinary Chinese citizen. They are beginning to have kind of pilots in different parts of China. They're very good at using apps and mobile phones and so on, and also giving people certain rewards or incentives for certain types of behavior. So I think in the coming times, you're going to see also that side of it coming forward. And I agree with you. If we understood more about how we use energy and other resources, what kind of policies or what kind of incentives and penalties could we have to also control behavior?
I have to say that disclosure is always difficult, but it's a work in progress. We're seeing many companies starting to disclose more on the entire carbon footprint, from scope 1, 2, and then to scope 3, and then further. So I think it's going to take some time, but we are sort of working on that overall. I think, as I see, as a community. Maybe we could take one more last question. I think we're sort of running out of time. Maybe the gentleman in the dark blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine, for your talk. Very interesting. As you said, there is something interesting in China, is that many of the decisions around the energy mix for the near-term, short, and long-term future is decided centrally by the government. So in other countries, though, we have seen sometimes public opinion pressuring the government and achieving to change actually some plan that has been made by the government. For example, in Germany with nuclear energy, actually it's often because around the question of nuclear energy, for example. Do you expect that public opinion in China will have a weight in shaping the energy future in China? Could there be opposition to more nuclear energy, for example? Or could there be opposition to keeping some coal in China? Basically the question is, could the public opinion have a weight in shaping the future of energy in China?
Maybe I can put it like this. You know, there's frequently a discussion about how sensitive the Chinese government is to public opinion. The Chinese government actually pays a lot of attention to what the public is thinking. They track many things, as we could see, you know, not from the energy side, but sort of from other social issues. So I would say the Chinese government is listening, you know, it is sensitive to what the people think. Secondly is, I haven't seen yet, up until now, whether significant numbers of ordinary citizens have necessarily a view about which type of energy. The Chinese government is very concerned about not having enough energy. Right? This notion of reliability, right? To be able to provide sufficient energy in good times and bad times. And you could say bad times is what's happening right now with extreme weather. So if you have no energy, because everything is taken down for a week or two, like I'm afraid we've seen that in the United States, you know, with some natural disasters on a big scale, then I think the Chinese government wants to be able to revive things, you know, strong resilience to deal with it very quickly. Are people against nuclear? I think there are pockets of people who question about different types of nuclear energy, but different types of energy. But I have not yet seen that these areas are big enough to fundamentally change the mix of how China is going to go forward.
Thank you for that. I think we ran over a little. And again, thank you, Christine, and appreciate having me. And thank you, Asia Society. Maybe I can hand it back to Holly.